This Sunday's Gospel reading is from Matthew chapter 22, and it's the story of the king who puts on a wedding banquet and invites guests who don't come, and then he gets his servants to bring other guests in. And as I've been reading this, it struck me as a really startling parable. It's a startling parable in its vivid depiction of two things. The first is of grace expressed through the generosity of the king and his invitations, but the second is judgment. And these two themes jostle together through the parable. It really is quite a remarkable story. But the problem we have is we're inhibited when we read it because of our own cultural assumptions. We're at some historical distance and cultural distance from the situation of Jesus and his hearers. We might read this invitation, and of course we know from that chorus we used to sing years ago, I cannot come to the banquet, and so on. I knew that song very well, and what I didn't realise is the way that song trivialises the story of the invitation and the refusal to attend. I guess that in our culture we kind of think that, he's put on this banquet, he's invited people, at the last minute they've suddenly found that they're preoccupied with some other occupation. So, okay, they can't come, but it's not that big a deal. But in the culture of Jesus' day, that's not the case at all. In the parallel parable in Luke's Gospel, which we don't need to see necessarily as a different version of the same thing. Jesus surely taught these parables on different occasions in different ways with slightly different emphasis. But in the parallel parable, Jesus says a bit more about the different excuses. One who has bought me a field, another one who's bought some cattle and needs to test them out, another one who's getting married. Now, we might treat some of those as kind of short-term, immediate decisions to make, but not at all in Jesus' day. For example, if you were going to buy a field, this is a decision of generational importance. This is going to be the food and the security for your family, possibly for generations to come. So it's not the sort of thing you would do in a hurry. You might go and visit the field at first. You might go and see what it looks like in the spring. You might wait and see what it's like in the summer, in the autumn. You'd want to know where the sun shines on it, how well the rain rains on it, whether it produces good fruit in a season. This is a long-term decision, a long-term activity. In other words, the guests aren't simply at the last minute saying, oh, I'm sorry, I'm a bit busy. They've already decided that they are committed to a different course of action. When they accepted the initial invitation, they already knew that they weren't going to attend. This then highlights the second aspect of the different culture in Jesus' day. When someone's going to put on a big feast or a banquet, it's an enormous amount of effort. So what would happen is that you'd issue the invitations to whoever you wanted to come. They would then reply, and on the basis of those replies, that would determine how many animals you slaughtered, how much food you'd prepare, because you knew these people had already given their commitment. I guess the parallel in our day is being invited around for dinner, and you're sitting and you're having aperitifs, drinks, you're having maybe little nibbles or something to start with. Then you come to sit at the table, and as the host puts the plate in front of you with food, that's the point at which you decide you're going to up and leave. You've got better things to do. So actually, in Jesus' day, this wasn't simply saying, I'm a bit too busy. This was a calculated decision to snub the host, in this case the king, but also communally, it was a public humiliation. This isn't just a casual dismissal. It's a deliberate decision to embarrass and to snub the host. And that's why the judgment comes. But of course, halfway through the parable then, we see the king is in his rage, says, that he'll go and he'll kill those people and burn their city. That doesn't really fit with the shape of the parable. And I think it's impossible here to avoid seeing an allusion to the future impending destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Now that raises all sorts of problems for us, all sorts of ethical issues about the language of God's judgment in the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's a subject for another time, but we just need to note that if that is what Matthew is saying, then he's just saying the same thing as the Old Testament prophets, where Isaiah, for example, attributes the impending destruction of Jerusalem to God's judgment through Nebuchadnezzar destroying the city. So we have a movement of grace and of generosity, this lavish feast, this invitation. Then comes a movement of judgment. But the anger of the king now turns to a second move of grace. He sends his servants out to the streets and to the market square and to invite everybody to come in and enjoy this feast. The king is determined that his generosity will not be wasted. And it points to a God who will not let his grace go to waste. And Matthew is really emphatic in that. He actually says, Jesus says, that the king demands that all will be brought in, the bad as well as the good, so that the wedding hall is full of guests. And then after this second move of grace, rather shockingly and uniquely to Matthew, comes a second turn to judgment. There's a wedding guest who's come in and who hasn't got the right clothes on. He's not wearing a wedding garment. And again, from our context, that might seem a little bit strange to that to be a cause of a problem and for the person to be bound hand and foot and be thrown out into the outer darkness where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth, a characteristic phrase that we find Matthew recording Jesus using again and again and again, talking about judgment. But again, we need to read this in its cultural context. Unlike in our day, where we might have gone out and bought an expensive special garment or dress for a wedding, and of course some people, especially if it's everybody's come off the street to the wedding, might not be able to afford it. In Jesus' day, it was quite different, that the wedding garment wouldn't be something you'd buy specially. It would be something you already had amongst your clothes, and you'd have cleaned it and put it on specially. Again, this is no accident that the guest, has not attired himself properly. It seems like a deliberate and a calculated snub. He's prepared to accept the invitation, but he simply isn't prepared to do anything about it in response. He's not prepared to put himself out at all in responding in the appropriate way to the king. There's a challenge here as well in terms of cultural values. I guess in reading this, very often for many of us, we come to it where our chief cultural value is autonomy and freedom and our decision to accept or reject an invitation. In Jesus' day, the values were quite different. What really mattered was honour and shame. What mattered was whether or not you're going to honour the person who has honoured you, who has lavished this generosity on you. Are you going to respond appropriately, or are you going to decide to snub them? But the other challenge is a theological one. And that is that in the Gospels and also in Paul, we discover the lavish and the generous grace of God. But alongside that, we also find the challenge to respond. If God's going to give us this fantastic feast and go to all the trouble of lavishing on us his generosity, the question is, are we going to make the decision to accept it? Are we going to break off from our other commitments and actually go out of our way to respond to the grace that God has offered to us? When we've been invited into the feast and we sit down with the other guests, are we going to be prepared to rise to the occasion and to respond in the appropriate way? John Barclay, who's a professor in Durham and a scholar of Paul, he's described Paul's understanding of grace in this way. For Paul, God's grace is not unconditional, but it's unconditioned. That is, you don't have to, there's no particular qualifications by which you merit or you deserve this grace. God pours out his grace to people regardless of their worth. But, he says, Paul doesn't see grace as unconditional. There are conditions to accepting it. That is, that we respond to God's invitation and that we then turn in repentance and start to live our life in the direction that God calls us to. And that's what the wedding robe in this parable is symbolic of. Paul, like Matthew, is telling a double story. Jesus here is directing this parable to the Jerusalem leaders, the leaders of the Jewish people and the people themselves, and says, look, God has laid on this feast for you. But if you won't come to the feast, if you won't leave your ways and respond to the message Jesus brings, well then, God's going to issue the invitation to other people, those who are on the fringes of Jewish society, and ultimately to Gentiles, people like you and like me. In Romans chapter 11, verse 22, Paul, as he's reflecting on the story of Israel and the fact that many Jews have not responded to Jesus as Messiah, he says this, consider both the kindness and the sternness of God. Consider his kindness. Consider the grace he's lavished out to you on Jesus. Consider the way that his grace has overflowed from the Jewish people even to you Gentiles. But take that kindness seriously and respond to it. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. So here we have this remarkable and striking parable. A parable which demonstrates God's lavish and generous grace. But also a parable that challenges us with the invitation. Will we respond? Will we lay down our other preoccupations? Will we turn to him, accept his invitation, come to the feast? And will we then live lives of obedience in response to the grace that God has lavished on us?